The Brecon Beacons do not care who you are. January 1979. The Black Mountains of South Wales. Elevation 2,906 feet above sea level. Temperature -11 degrees Celsius before the wind chill strips that number to something almost incomprehensible, something that makes standard cold weather do doctrine feel like a suggestion written by someone who had never actually stood on this ground. The rain here does not fall. It moves horizontally, in sheets, driven by a wind that arrives from the Irish Sea carrying nothing but malice and moisture. The peat bogs on the plateau hold water the way a sponge holds it, never releasing, always absorbing, pulling boots down with a sucking sound that seems almost deliberate. The grass, yellow and matted, lies flat in the wind like something already dead. The rocks, when you can find them, are slick with a thin rime of ice beneath a film of black water. Every handhold lies. At night, this landscape becomes a different category of hostile press. There is no ambient light here. None. The clouds that pin themselves to the ridgeline block every star. A man lying still in that darkness, without a torch, without movement, without sound from another human being, experiences a particular kind of silence that civilian existence simply cannot manufacture. It is the silence of a world that has decided you are irrelevant. It presses against the eardrums. It enters the lungs with every breath, cold and mineral and utterly indifferent. In that darkness, in that cold, in that wind, men were moving. They had been moving for 19 hours. They would move for another 11. They carried loads that, because numbers tell the truth when narrative cannot, averaged 36 kilograms, a weight equivalent to carrying a teenage child on your back while climbing and descending the equivalent of a 7-story building every 40 minutes, repeatedly across terrain specifically selected, because it offers no mercy and no shortcuts. They carried this weight wearing boots that had long since soaked through. They carried it on legs that had not properly rested in 4 days. They did not complain. This is the first thing you need to understand about them. They did not complain because they had already stopped thinking of discomfort as a category of information. It had become, simply, the background condition of their existence. What happened in these mountains over the following 18 months, what this training exchange produced, what it revealed, what it prophesied, became one of the most uncomfortable chapters in the institutional history of American special operations. Uncomfortable enough that official accounts still prefer not to linger on it. Uncomfortable enough that the full picture required years of piecemeal testimony, declassified feeder action reports, and the candid admissions of retired officers speaking without lawyers present. Because what these mountains proved, what the Brecon Beacons and the men who moved through them in silence proved, is something that certain institutions spend enormous resources trying not to believe. They prove that you cannot buy your way to competence. You can only earn it. On one side of this story stands the 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment, Delta, activated officially on the 19th of November 1977 at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. Budget at that point classified, but the infrastructure, the facilities, the recruitment pipeline, and the political will behind it represented an investment that dwarfed anything the United States Army had previously committed to a counterterrorism unit. Delta trained in a purpose-built facility known internally as the Compound, a shooting house, a parachute low feet, extensive communications infrastructure, vehicles, specialized weapons, and a support apparatus that, by 1979, employed more administrative and logistics personnel than most line infantry battalions. Delta was America's answer to the Munich Olympics, to the Entebbe hijacking, to a world that had decided terrorism was a permanent feature of the geopolitical landscape. It was built to be the best. It was funded to be the best. And it believed, with the particular confidence of institutions that have never been truly tested, that it was the best. The man who built it understood the alternative. Colonel Charles Alvin Beckwith, age 582 in 1979. Former Green Beret, winner of the Silver Star, 2 Legion of Merit Awards, 2 Distinguished Flying Crosses, and 3 Purple Hearts. A man built by all physical and institutional measures for exactly this kind of work. But what mattered about Beckwith, what made him simultaneously the right man to build Delta and the complicated figure at the center of this story, was what had happened to him in 1962. That year, Beckwith had traveled to Hereford, England, to train with the 22nd Special Air Service Regiment. He had spent a year with them. What he witnessed had altered him permanently. He had gone to Hereford as a confident, decorated American officer. He had arrived to find a unit that operated on a philosophy so different from anything in his experience that it required a complete recalibration of everything he thought he knew about special operations. He later wrote, in his memoir Delta Force, words that should have been stamped on the wall of every American Special Operations headquarters in existence. "When I got to the SAS, I was a big fish in a small pond. I found out I was a minnow." Beckwith came home and spent 15 years trying to build something like what he had seen. Delta was the result. The question, the uncomfortable, catastrophic question, was whether the result actually captured the essence of the original. On the other side of this story stands the 22nd Special Air Service Regiment, B Squadron and D Squadron active in this period. Based at Stirling Lines, Credenhill relocated from Bradbury Lines, Hereford, but the soul of the unit lived not in any barracks but in the Brecon Beacons and the mountains of Snowdonia, where every man who wore the sandy beret had broken himself completely before being allowed to stand among them. The SAS operated on a budget that, compared to Delta's, was almost embarrassing. Per-operator funding in 1979 was a fraction of the American equivalent. Their facilities were functional rather than impressive. Their vehicles were a feed and borrowed. Their weapons were occasionally obsolete. What they had instead was selection, a process that lasted months, consumed men at a rate that institutional observers found almost alarming, and produced a survivor who had been stripped of everything that was not genuine. The SAS selection pass rate hovered between 10 and 15% in this era. Of every 100 men who began the process, between 80 to 5 and 90 never finished it. The ones who remained were not necessarily the fastest, the strongest, or the most physically gifted. They were the ones who had discovered, in the Brecon Beacons, in the cold and the dark and the weight, that they contained something that could not be extinguished. Brigadier Peter de la Billière, who would later command British forces in the Gulf War, commanded 22 SAS during much of this period. He was 45 years old. He had served with the SAS for 20 years. He had seen action in Malaya, Oman, Dhofar, and a dozen operations that would not be declassified for another generation. When he spoke about the exchange visits with Delta, he chose his words with the precision of a man who understood that some truths are best left to implication. His assessment of early Delta performance, recorded in his memoir Looking for Trouble, was delivered with the understated economy that defined every sentence the SS ever produced about its own work. He noted that the American unit showed considerable enthusiasm. He did not note what enthusiasm without the foundation of sufficient selection tends to produce under pressure. He did not need to. The mountains had already answered that question. The exchange began formally in late 1978. Delta operators arrived at Hereford. SAS operators traveled to Fort Bragg. The Americans brought funding, equipment, and the confidence of an institution that had been told repeatedly by the most senior figures in the American defense establishment that it represented the future of unconventional warfare. The British brought silence, patience, and the quiet knowledge of men who have been completely broken and rebuilt and are no longer frightened of either process. One exchange operator, a Delta sergeant whose name remains protected under a privacy request filed with the Department of the Army in 1995, a detail that itself tells you something about what followed, later told a researcher working on a classified internal review of Delta's early operational period. "The first thing they did when we got there was take us out to the hills. No briefing, no acclimatization period, no equipment orientation. Just you're going, here's your pack, here's your grid, start walking." I remember thinking, where are the vehicles? We always had vehicles. He paused, the researcher noted, before adding, that was the first problem. We always had vehicles. He didn't know, standing at the start line on that first morning, that the vehicles were not coming, that there never had been vehicles. That the question he was asking, where are the vehicles, was precisely the question the mountains had been designed to make him stop asking. The exchange program ran through 1978 and into 1979, and by any superficial measure it looked successful. Joint exercises, shared techniques, cross-training on communications, weapons handling, and hostage rescue drills. The official Joint Defeater Action Review, produced by the Joint Special Operations Command in December 1978 and partially declassified in 2003, noted productive interoperability development and significant enhancement of bilateral counterterrorism capability. The language was appropriate. Carefully bureaucratic. It said nothing about what the British soldiers had actually observed, and it was silent. deliberately, institutionally silent on what the mountains had revealed. Because the mountains had revealed something that no official report was willing to commit to paper. Delta's operators were fit. They were skilled. They were technically proficient in a way that their British counterparts respected without reservation. But they were fit for a specific duration, under specific conditions, with specific support. When the SAS took them beyond those conditions, extended duration, no resupply, no communications comfort, no vehicle extraction, a gap appeared. Not in every man, not uniformly, but in enough men with enough consistency that it could not be attributed to individual variance. It was a systemic signature. The signature of a training pipeline that had not yet fully internalized what the Brecon Beacons had spent 30 years trying to teach, an SAS warrant officer who participated in the joint exercises during this period, speaking to the British military historian Anthony Kemp for his 1994 study, The SAS, Savage Wars of Peace, offered a characteristically compact assessment. They were good lads, good skills. But some of them had never really been uncomfortable before, not properly uncomfortable. You could see it in their eyes around day 3. Some of them had never met that version of themselves before. The Americans, to their credit, knew it. The sergeant whose name is protected, continuing his testimony to the Internal Review Board, used the 5 words that became the title of this video. Standing in a Hereford briefing room a training cycle that had not gone as planned, being debriefed by an SAS officer who maintained the courtesy of not making direct comparisons, he said quietly and without self-pity, "They made us look pathetic, harsh." And then, before anyone in the American chain of command had fully processed what the mountains had been trying to say, the world provided a real-world test. April 24, 1980, the Iranian desert. Operation Eagle Claw. The mission was to rescue 583 American hostages held at the United States Embassy in Tehran. It was, by every measure of operational complexity, one of the most ambitious counterterrorism operations ever attempted. The plan required 8 Navy RH-53DC Stallion helicopters to fly from the USS Nimitz in the Gulf of Oman, low-level through Iranian airspace, to a desert staging area codenamed Desert 1 approximately 200 miles southeast of Tehran. There, Delta Force, 93 operators under the operational command of the Joint Task Force, would link up with the helicopters, refuel from 6EC, 130 tanker aircraft feed already waiting at the site, and proceed to a second staging area, Desert 2, to wait for the following night's assault into Tehran. The planners had estimated a minimum of 6 operational helicopters to proceed. The mathematics left no margin for error. They should have listened to the mountains. The first signs appeared before the helicopters had been in the air for an hour. Haboob. A wall of suspended dust, not a storm in the conventional sense, but a phenomenon of the Iranian interior that the mission weather briefers had identified as a low-probability event, a 1 in 10 chance, and had not sufficiently weighted in the mission calculus. It reached down from altitude and turned visibility to near zero. Helicopter 6 turned back at 11 p.m. after a navigation instrument failure, the pilot making a judgment call that, individually, was entirely defensible. Helicopter 5 turned back shortly after, citing hydraulic problems. Those 2 losses reduced the available fleet to 6, exactly the minimum threshold. 6 was not 6 with margin. 6 was 6 with none. Major General James Vaught, age 5E6, commanding the Joint Task Force from an EC-135 Airborne Command Post, learned of the aircraft losses in real time. 23 years of military service, a decorated veteran of Korea and Vietnam. A man who had been selected specifically because of his capacity for operational judgment under pressure. In the cramped, red-lit interior of that aircraft, he had a decision to make. The mission calculus said 6 was the minimum. He had 6. He was advised to proceed. What he did not yet know, what nobody in the airborne command post knew, was that Helicopter 2 had a problem that its crew had not yet fully characterized. A hairline crack in the rotor blade assembly, not immediately fatal, not immediately visible, but present. The helicopters arrived at Desert 1 between 30 and 90 minutes behind schedule. The fueling operations began. The dust that had plagued the transit lingered, coating equipment reducing visibility, irritating the lungs of every man on the ground. The C-130 tankers were functioning. Delta was on the ground, staged, ready. For approximately 45 minutes, it appeared that the mission might survive its opening complications. And then, Helicopter 2 landed. The crew reported the hydraulic problem that had been developing throughout the transit. The aircraft feed was grounded. The mission threshold, 6 operational helicopters had been broken. They were down to 5. Colonel Beckwith, 45 years old, standing at Desert 1 in the dust and the darkness with his men around him and the entire weight of a 7-month planning cycle behind him, made the call that the mission abort criteria required him to make. He recommended abort. General Vaught concurred. The order was transmitted. What happened next, what happened in the next 6 minutes, was not the result of enemy action. It was not the result of hostile fire. It was not even, strictly speaking, the result of the equipment failures that had brought the mission to this point. What happened next was the result of the most dangerous force in any high-stakes military operation, the accumulated pressure of men trying to untangle a situation that had stopped following the plan. Helicopter 3, repositioning in the darkness and dust to clear the refueling area for the C-130s preparing to depart, struck the right wing of EC 130 Romeo 5 at 2:40 local time. The rotor blades of the helicopter contacted the fuselage of the tanker aircraft feet. The fuel-laden tanker ignited. The fireball was visible from miles away. 5 airmen aboard the C-130 and 3 Marines aboard the helicopter were killed instantly. The desert, which had been hostile and silent and dark, became something else entirely, a column of orange fire rising into the Iranian night, visible to any observer within 30 kilometers, consuming not just metal and fuel, but the entire premise of the operation. Beckwith's own account of the next minutes, recorded in his memoir and corroborated by multiple feeder action depositions, is a document of controlled disintegration. 93 of the most highly trained counterterrorism operators in the United States military were suddenly managing a burning crash site in a foreign desert, loading casualties onto surviving aircraft, destroying sensitive equipment and documents that could not be allowed to fall into Iranian hands, and doing all of this while knowing that the fires were broadcasting their location to the entire Iranian military apparatus. They got out. Not cleanly, not intact, but they got out. They leave feet behind 8 dead. They leave feet behind 6 helicopters. They leave feet behind classified documents, communication plans, and most devastatingly of all, a set of photographs of American agents inside Iran who were now compromised, endangered, and in several cases never seen again. The official casualty count, 8 dead. The operational damage behind that number was exponentially worse. The Holloway Commission, convened within weeks of the disaster and chaired by Admiral James Holloway, produced a report that ran to 170 pages. Its classified annexes have still not been fully released. Made available to Congress in August 1980, used language that would have been recognizable to anyone familiar with the tradition of institutional self-protection. It cited command and control deficiencies, inadequate joint training, and weather forecast limitations. It used words like suboptimal to describe decisions that had gotten 8 men killed and compromised an unknown number of intelligence assets. Suboptimal. 8 men dead in a burning helicopter in the Iranian desert. Suboptimal. Meanwhile, at Sterling Lines, Hereford, the 22nd SAS Regiment had known about Operation Eagle Claw, not the classified details, but they had known the broad parameters. They had been aware that Delta was planning a hostage rescue operation of considerable ambition, and they had, through the channels available to Allied Special Operations communities in 1980, offered their institutional knowledge. The offer had been considered. It had been routed through the appropriate chains of command. It had arrived at a planning level where the political calculus was clear. A hostage rescue mounted with British assistance would look, to a domestic audience still raw from months of television coverage of blindfolded Americans, like the United States could not solve its own problems. The Carter administration was 14 months from an election. The optics of calling in the British were deemed unacceptable. The offer was declined with diplomatic grace. This is the bureaucratic betrayal at the center of this story. Not one man's bad decision, not one failure of nerve or judgment. A systemic choice made at the intersection of operational planning and political self-consciousness that substituted image management for honest assessment. The SAS had spent 30 years learning, in the Brecon Beacons and in Malaya and in Dhofar, what happens when a mission is designed for what it looks like rather than for what it needs to be. They had learned it with casualties of their own. They had tried through the appropriate channels to share what they knew. The appropriate channels said, "Thank you, we'll take it from here." In the smoking aftermath of Desert One, with 8 flag-draped coffins and a congressional investigation and an Iranian propaganda apparatus working 24 hours a day to maximize the humiliation, the British said nothing. They did not say, "We told you." They did not say, "You should have listened." They said nothing. Because saying nothing was both the professional thing to do and, in its silence, more devastating than any words could have been. De la Billière, asked years later whether the outcome at Desert One might have been different with British involvement, paused for a characteristic beat before answering. The pause, those who knew him understood, contained the actual answer. What he said aloud was, "Different operations produce different results for many reasons." 6 words that contained everything and committed to nothing. A masterclass in understatement from a man who had spent a career making understatement carry the weight of unspeakable things. What exactly went wrong? Not just at Desert One, but structurally, doctrinally, at the level of institutional philosophy? The answer is not simple, and it is not flattering to any single party. But it is clear. The SAS selection process in 1979 consisted of 4 phases across a minimum of 6 months. Phase 1, endurance. 3 weeks of progressive load carrying in the Brecon Beacons, culminating in an event known as long drag or endurance, a 40-mile navigation march with a 25-kilogram Bergen Plus rifle, completed in under 20 hours, over terrain specifically chosen to destroy men who are fit enough but not resilient enough. No support, no encouragement, no indication of whether you are passing or failing. The entire point institutionally is to create a situation where the candidate has nothing to rely upon except whatever is actually inside him when everything external has been removed. The pass rate for this phase alone across the decade of the 1970s averaged 12%. Phase 2, jungle training, Belize. Phase 3, combat survival, resistance to interrogation. Phase 4, continuation training across all special operations disciplines. Total duration from first parade to beret, a minimum of 12 months. Many candidates required 14 to 16 months if they failed and recycled phases. The entire process was designed not to produce a man with a particular skill set, though it did produce that, but to answer a specific question. Does this man have a relationship with adversity that is fundamentally different from a normal person's relationship with adversity? Not a higher pain threshold, something more structural than that. An absence of the category of complaint. Delta's selection process, as designed by Beckwith and operational through 1980, ran approximately 4 weeks. It was demanding, genuinely. So, the physical standards were high, the stress inoculation real, the assessment continuous. But 4 weeks against 12 to 16 months is not a quantitative difference. It is a qualitative one. 4 weeks can tell you whether a man is fit, skilled, motivated, and technically capable. It cannot tell you, it does not have time to tell you, whether he has ever truly met himself in the dark at 36 kilograms in minus 11 degrees, a feeder 4 days without proper rest with no vehicle coming. Because that meeting, the one the Brecon Beacons forces, is not a single event. It is something that has to happen repeatedly, across months, until the man on the other side of it stops being a stranger. The 1981 Rand Corporation analysis of the Eagle Claw failure report R. 2829 AF, authored by defense analyst William Simons and partially declassified in 1990, identified what it called a preparation duration gap in Joint Special Operations training. In measured language appropriate to a think tank document, it noted that the American counterterrorism pipeline had prioritized skills acquisition over what it termed resilience department. The analysis pointed specifically to the abandonment of extended duration isolation exercises in Delta's final pre-deployment training. Those exercises, multi-day unsupported navigation operations in demanding terrain, had been cut from the schedule in November 1979 to allow more time for mission-specific rehearsal. The decision was logical within its own operational frame. It was precisely the kind of trade-off that seems rational until the moment the mission stops following the plan. The SAS had never made that trade-off. Because the SAS had never had the luxury of believing the plan would hold, there is a secondary story here that proves the pattern is not unique to Eagle Claw. In May 1980, 17 days after the desert catastrophe, 22 SAS conducted Operation Nimrod, the assault on the Iranian embassy in Prince's Gate, London, where 6 terrorists of the Democratic Revolutionary Front for the Liberation of Arabistan were holding 26 hostages. The operation lasted 11 minutes and 17 seconds from first breach to final clearance. 5 of the 6 terrorists were killed. 1 was captured. All hostages, but 1, who died from wounds inflicted by the terrorists before the assault, survived. The SAS lost no men. The operation was filmed in its entirety from the street by BBC cameras that happened to be covering a nearby event when the assault began, creating one of the most watched pieces of live television in British broadcasting history. 11 minutes, 26 survivors, 0 SAS casualties. The contrast required no editorial comment. The calendar provided it. 17 days of Feeder Desert 1, 17 days of Feeder. 8 Americans had died in a burning helicopter in Iran in an operation that had been 18 months in planning. The SAS had resolved an international terrorist incident in 11 minutes. The Brecon Beacons and everything they stood for had answered. The aftermath of Eagle Claw was, institutionally, a study in competing imperatives. The honest imperative: understand exactly what went wrong, at every level, and fix it regardless of how uncomfortable that process is, competed with the political imperative, which was survival. The Carter administration, already weakened by the hostage crisis, absorbed the disaster by accepting the framing offered by the Holloway Commission: equipment failure, weather, and the inherent complexity of long-range clandestine operations. These were real factors. They were not the complete story. They were not even the most important part of the story. Beckwith himself, to his enduring credit, did not hide from the institutional truth. In Delta Force, published in 1983, he wrote with a directness that must have made the Department of the Army deeply uncomfortable: "We didn't have enough time. Not enough time to train together, not enough time to know each other in the dark, not enough time to find out who we really were when everything went wrong." He had spent a year with the SAS. He understood what that time had done to him. He understood in 1983, looking back at the desert, that the men he had taken to Iran had not had that year. Could not have had it. There had not been time. But the mountains do not care about your schedule. The mountains do not grant extensions. The classified annex of the Holloway Report, fragments of which have emerged through Freedom of Information requests filed between 1995 and 2008, contained a recommendation that does not appear in the public version. The recommendation, sourced to a senior officer whose name remains redacted, proposed extended duration isolation training modeled on Allied selection processes as a mandatory component of Delta Force preparation for future operations. The recommendation was accepted. It was incorporated into what became known internally as the Delta Curriculum Revision of 1981. The revision extended selection from 4 weeks to a process that, while still shorter than the SAS model, included extended duration navigation exercises in demanding terrain that had been absent from the original design. It was Beckwith who had brought the SAS template to America. It was Eagle Claw that had forced the completion of the translation. But the men who drove that revision, who insisted on the mountains, who insisted on the dark and the weight and the duration, never received public recognition for their role in what Delta ultimately became. The SAS operators who had watched during those 1978 and 1979 exchange visits and had quietly, without comment, noted what they observed, and had returned to Hereford and continued doing exactly what they had always done. They were not invited to the congressional hearings. They were not cited in the official postmortems. When the revised Delta selection process produced its first graduates in 1982, the British connection was not mentioned in the internal documentation. It was not mentioned because mentioning it would have required acknowledging what the mountains had already said. What does this story actually mean? Not the operational details. Those are the mechanism, not the message. Not the equipment failures or the weather or the command and control deficiencies, real as all of those were.
What does the essential architecture of this story mean?
It means that competence is not a characteristic. It is not a budget line. It is not a facility or a weapon system or a recruitment brochure. Competence is what remains when the plan stops working, when the vehicles do not come, when the weather refuses to cooperate, when the threshold is breached and the mission should abort but the mission cannot abort. Because too many people with too much authority have too much invested in a particular outcome. Competence is what you have built, over months and years of deliberate discomfort in the space between who you thought you were and who you actually are. The SAS had not built that competence cheaply or quickly or without cost. The Brecon Beacons are littered, metaphorically, and in some cases literally, with the careers and the confidence and the ambitions of men who arrived there believing they were already sufficient. The mountains disagreed. Most of them accepted the verdict and went home. The ones who did not, the 12%, the 15%, the men who stood in the dark at -11 degrees at hour 30 of a 40-hour march with 36 kilograms on their back and decided, for reasons they often cannot fully articulate, that they would take one more step. Those men became something different. Not superhuman, not free from fear or exhaustion or doubt, but different in their relationship to those things, different in the knowledge that they have already been completely broken and are still standing. That knowledge cannot be purchased. It cannot be absorbed in 4 weeks. And in the Iranian desert on the night of April 24, 1980, when the plan broke and the fire started and 8 men died and the entire elaborate architecture of 7 months of planning came apart in 6 burning minutes, the gap between institutions that had that knowledge and institutions that were still acquiring it became visible in the most brutal possible way. The Brecon Beacons do not care who you are. They do not care about your budget, your political backing, your briefing slides, or the official communiques that describe your unit as the finest counterterrorism force in the world. They care about one thing only, what you are made of when every external support has been removed, and the question is simply whether you will take one more step. The SAS had been answering that question the same way, in the same mountains for 30 years before the first Delta operator ever arrived at Hereford. And the mountains knew the answer before any of them did. Because the mountains are patient, and patient things outlast everything that is not genuinely built to last. Technology fails. Budgets expire. Plans collapse the moment they make contact with reality. Training is the only thing that stays with a man when everything else is gone.